chair, but you know, Shuki's gone, so I am going to have to step in and introduce Peter Bergen, whom you've probably all seen on television. Is really one, as I indicated in the note, is one of the leading journalists in the country, and has been at the forefront of covering both Bin Laden and Al Qaeda and all the developments in terrorism for the last 10, 15 years. And I say 50, really going back to the mid-90s. So he's been there well before 9/11, and it was 97. Yeah, 97. We described it in the book, but 97 in this interviewed was the only American journalist to interview Bin Laden in an amazing story that he describes. And he has written a number of things. The book that he's going to talk about today is Manhunt, The Search for Bin Laden. And we, as usual, have it for sale up there. And so everybody can buy a copy, and then in the reception, you can get him to sign it. I always like to say, authors, it's one of the great narcissistic pleasures of writing a book, to be able to sign copies that people buy who then hear your lecture. So, Peter? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Strozo, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks for coming today. And you know, Kindle doesn't allow you to sign books, unfortunately. But eventually they'll come up with a feature that will let you do that. So, you know, this book, Manhunt, was the fourth book that I wrote about Al Qaeda, and I've been, as Chuck indicated, been writing or thinking about Bin Laden and Al Qaeda for a long time before I wrote the book, and so I was able, I think, to distill quite a lot of thinking into one relatively short volume, which I began writing the day after Bin Laden was killed. And I had a pretty tight deadline, which is actually a good thing because I tend to blow deadlines, and I think deadlines are useful. They brought a certain energy to the writing of the book because I had about 10 months to report and write and research and edit. And so this is the first book I've ever sat down in a very self-conscious way, instead of just sort of writing and writing and writing and hoping that it will come out at the end okay. Sort of have a much better, I had a much better plan going in to write this book. And the plan basically, I thought I needed to answer 5 or 6 big questions, which were, one, what was Bin Laden doing after 9/11? And as a subset of that, to what extent was he controlling Al Qaeda? And as a subset of that, how was Al Qaeda doing in general? 2, what was the CIA story of finding Bin Laden, which is really an Agatha Christie story of how they did that. Interestingly, and appropriately for an Agatha Christie story, many of the people involved in that hunt were women at the agency. 3rd, the sort of evolution of Joint Special Operations Command, which did the operation, and which is a very different animal today than it would have been in the 90s. And one of the reasons that President Obama basically was pretty comfortable with authorizing the mission was he had very little reason to worry that the mission would fail militarily. There were a lot of other things he had to worry about politically about the mission, but militarily, as an operation that could be pulled off by this group of men, he did not have to worry himself too much. And as you know, there were still problems with the mission. And another sort of thing I had to deal with to some degree was the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, which was at an all-time low during this operation. And then, of course, I had to deal with the decision-making process in the White House and President Obama as a decision-maker, and also President Obama, parenthetically, as a commander-in-chief. And this is a lot clearer now than it would have been when I started writing, I think. But you know, this is one of the most aggressive, militarily aggressive presidents of the post-World War II era, which I think was pretty surprising for a lot of people who voted for him in 2008, because he's not the president I think that they thought that they were voting for. And one of the things that I did in the book was to go back and look at some of his key speeches before he was elected president and shortly after he was elected president, as a clue to trying to understand him as a commander-in-chief. And he was very explicit about his views about the use of force in two key speeches that I went back to for the book. One was a speech he gave on August the 1st, 2007, I believe was the date, at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And this was his big keynote foreign policy speech because, of course, the presumptive Democratic candidate was Hillary Clinton, who was regarded as having foreign policy credentials by virtue of the fact that she was First Lady for 8 years. She was also on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And the presumptive Republican candidate was John McCain, who, of course, had been on the Senate Armed Services Committee for 30 years, and was also seen as somebody with real national security credentials. And the speech which he gave at Woodrow Wilson was written with Lee Hamilton, who ran the Woodrow Wilson Center at that time, who had been the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee for many years. Ben Rhodes, who would then go on to become the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications. Susan Rice, who of course is the National Security Advisor now. And Dennis McDonough, who's now the Chief of Staff. And they basically, they knew that this speech was a key speech to explain who President Obama was, or potentially President Obama was on foreign policy. And they labored over one particular line in the speech at some length, and that was a line which essentially said that if it was clear that the Pakistanis were not going to go after some high-value target in Pakistan, and that the United States knew about the presence of this person, that the United States would reserve the right to go into Pakistan unilaterally to capture or kill this target. And this, you may recall, produced a chorus of condemnation from all sides, from both the Democrats and the Republicans, when this particular part of the speech was reported. Governor Mitt Romney, who was a Republican candidate for president at the time, described Barack Obama as a Dr. Strangelove. Christopher Dodd, who was also a candidate for president, said something equally disparaging. Hillary Clinton said something disparaging. John McCain said something disparaging about, this is a guy who's going to attack our allies, etc. But from the very beginning, Barack Obama said that he was willing to take unilateral action against al-Qaeda in a country that was nominally an ally of the United States. Fast forward a couple of years, and I looked at President Obama's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in Oslo. Very early on in his presidency, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And he must have been the first person in history to go and accept the Nobel Peace Prize and outline his philosophy of war during his acceptance speech. And basically, he said, much as I admire him, I think it's one of the best speeches. I'm sure he wrote it largely himself. It's a very well-written speech, and I'm paraphrasing it rather than quoting from it. He said, much as I admire Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, nonviolence wouldn't have stopped the Nazis, and nonviolence is unlikely to stop al-Qaeda, and it's not a group you can negotiate with. And essentially, it was a sort of an outline of his theory of just wars. And so when you take these two speeches together, in a sense, the decision that he ultimately made, and in fact his whole drone campaign, is a lot less surprising than people might have considered it initially. And I don't have a really good answer for why he is very comfortable with the use of American power, but I will make the observation that he's the first major American political figure for a very long time who what he did or did not do in Vietnam is not part of his story. So, unlike Dick Cheney, who took five deferments, or George W. Bush, who was in the Texas National Guard, or John McCain, who of course spent 5 years in prison in Vietnam, or Bill Clinton, who basically got, was at the University of Oxford during the time he might have served in Vietnam, or John Kerry, who of course did serve in Vietnam. It's that the Vietnam experience has been a huge part of all these political stories, and it's just completely absent in Barack Obama's story because he was too young to either serve or not serve, and in a way he's not haunted by that the experience of Vietnam. And I don't know if that's a good answer to why he's very comfortable with use of American power, but I think it may be an answer. So President Obama as a decision maker was certainly something I needed to deal with in the book. And I'll get into the actual decisions in a little bit. But before we get there, let me first of all paint a picture of what Osama bin Laden was doing after 9/11, and we have pretty good detail on that. And then explain the Agatha Christie story about how he was found, and a little bit of the military story behind the Joint Special Operations Command. So after 9/11, as you know, Osama bin Laden fled ultimately to Tora Bora in eastern Afghanistan, which is an area which is mountains that rise to 14,000 feet and is a very good place to disappear. There are multiple exit routes into Pakistan. There was a battle there basically from about December 3rd to December 14th, 2001. And you may recall in the 2004 campaign, John Kerry made a big issue of the fact that the Bush administration essentially let bin Laden go at the Battle of Tora Bora, not wittingly, but de facto. And Tommy Franks, who was in charge of the operation there, he was the head of CENTCOM, actually wrote an editorial in the New York Times saying that Kerry was wrong, that the intelligence that bin Laden was at Tora Bora was sketchy, and he could have been a lot of other places. That was all total nonsense, by the way. During the battle, there were multiple interceptions of bin Laden's voice on the radio by people on the ground who recognized his voice, who'd been tracking him. There was a request from the CIA officers on the ground for a battalion of Rangers to be put in, 800 men. That request was turned down by Tommy Franks, and I was able actually to have an email exchange with him about what his reasoning was, why he turned down that request. And it's in the book. Basically, he had a whole laundry list of reasons, including we didn't know if bin Laden was there. We didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the Soviets. It would have taken a long time. And all of these, by the way, I think are false in one way or another. You could have. I've actually talked to General Stanley McChrystal about this issue after the book came out, who was at the time the head of the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg. He said, look, we could have put a battalion of Rangers in there within a week. Now, would bin Laden have been caught? I don't know. You know, it was it was in the middle of winter. This is a very difficult terrain. But one factoid speaks for itself. There were more journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora than American soldiers. So, you know, I can say that with a great deal of precision because there were about 70 U.S. Special Forces at the battle, and you know, maybe a handful of CIA officers, a dozen British Special Boat Service officers, and there were at least 100 journalists at the height of the battle. So if Fox and CNN and the Washington Post and every other news organization could manage to get their teams there, you know, it certainly raises a question about why the United States couldn't get a greater force there. So anyway, bin Laden disappeared from the Battle of Tora Bora, and we now know that he did something very clever, which is instead of going into Pakistan, which is where you expect him to go, he doubled back into eastern Afghanistan to an area called Kunar, which is very mountainous and heavily wooded, and he spent a few months there. Then he moved to Peshawar in Pakistan, which is a city of several million people on the border in 2002. And I can say all this with a great deal of certainty because after the paperback edition of my book came out, no, in fact, before this edition came out, a Islamabad police report summarizing the interrogation of one of his wives became public. And that really reconstructs exactly what bin Laden was doing for the 9 years he was in Pakistan. So he lived in Peshawar in 2002. He then moved north into Swat, which is where the Pakistani Taliban, you know, staged quite a renaissance in 2009. He was in a number of cities around the Swat region, and eventually he got to Abbottabad, which is in central northern Pakistan. He arrived there in the summer of 2005. During that period, bin Laden had 4 kids. Most fugitives don't have multiple children when they're on the run. Certainly not the world's most wanted man. He was with his wives, 2 of them. His third wife joined in 2010. The wives are kind of unexpected. One was 63-year-old Saudi PhD in Quranic theology. The second was a 53-year-old again with a PhD, a Saudi. These were highly educated women. They basically married bin Laden knowing that in their own minds he was a jihadi war hero. And the youngest wife was a Yemeni who didn't graduate from high school. She's the one that he had the 4 kids with while he was on the run. And these these were with him. So when he was on the run, he had for a good chunk of the time, he had 12 kids and grandkids with him and 3 wives. He arrives in Abbottabad, and he lives there, and I was the only outside observer to get into the compound before it was demolished by the Pakistanis. And I didn't know it was going to be demolished 2 weeks after I visited, but it did allow me to get a pretty good sense of how bin Laden was living. And he was not living, it was a pretty rudimentary life. They were, the compound probably cost a couple $100,000 to build. It certainly wasn't $1 million mansion as it was initially portrayed. They were growing their own crops. They were self-sufficient. They had their own cows, cattle, chickens, honeybees, vegetables. They didn't really have to go out much, which of course was good for security. There were 3 families living on the compound, the 2 bodyguards who were also the couriers and their wives and kids, and bin Laden's wives and kids. The compound extended over about an acre. There was no air conditioning for a place that got hot in the summer. Very little heating. I was able to examine the gas and electricity bills. They were spending, $25 a month on gas and electricity. They were sleeping on beds that were like almost made of this kind of material. It was or actually much worse. It was basically sort of like bits of wood sort of hammered together. And so it was a Spartan existence. On the other hand, for the world's most wanted man, it wasn't a bad situation. He was surrounded by his wives and kids. He was able to, the couriers were bringing him stuff they were printing off the internet. He was spending a lot of time writing very lengthy memos to Al-Qaeda members, and this gets to the extent to which he was in control of the organization. He was writing, he was communicating with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. He said Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni American, should not become the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. He was comfortable with the leadership that existed. He was sending notes to al-Shabaab in Somalia. Now, it's not clear if they ever got through, but he was certainly composing these. He said to al-Shabaab in Somalia, don't rename yourself Al-Qaeda. It'll be bad for fundraising. It's going to attract a lot of negative attention. And by the way, stop attacking civilians in the middle of Mogadishu. And there was a lot of discussion within Al-Qaeda about how damaging Al-Qaeda in Iraq had been to them with their campaign against Muslim civilians, and how Al-Qaeda, the brand, had been very damaged. A lot of discussion about how they were running out of money. A great deal of discussion about how damaging the CIA drone program was to their leadership. And bin Laden, in these memos that he was writing, I think showed a pretty good understanding of how badly damaged his organization was. His self-assessment of where they were would match with, I think, any reasonable person's assessment of where Al-Qaeda was at the time. And he was blue skying about killing President Obama and killing General Petraeus for the 10th anniversary of 9/11, but these were clearly not serious plots. He had a lot of time on his hands to write these memos. One of them runs to 46 pages. Now, of course, you can read them all on West Point's counterterrorism site. So that's kind of the picture of where bin Laden was living, how he was living. So then let's switch focus to the question of how CIA found him. And that is a quite involved story. And there was a realization at the CIA from 2003, 2004 that there was going to be no detainee who knew where bin Laden was. There was going to be no detainee who was going to give them any really substantial help on that issue, even if they were waterboarded. There was going to be no detainee there was going to be no magic bullet, and that they basically needed to get back to kind of first principles to think about how to find bin Laden. It was going to, and so there's a female analyst in the book. I name her, I think, Renee, who wrote a book and wrote a memo in 2005, saying it was entitled "Pillars," and she said, we should basically look at all the intelligence we've collected already, and we should look forward at any intelligence we gather in the future, and we should filter it through 4 basic pillars on which we shall place the bin Laden hunt. And one was communication. We might be able to find bin Laden through communication with the media. Clearly, bin Laden was communicating with the media. We released 30 video and audio tapes at least after 9/11. Many of them went to Al Jazeera. They are physical products that had to be taken to Al Jazeera, to its bureau in Islamabad or its headquarters in Qatar. And Al Jazeera wasn't the only organization getting videotapes and audio tapes. They also went to other networks. So could you trace back the chain of custody of these tapes? Was one question. The second possible method was was there any way to intercept communications between bin Laden and his immediate family? Was there any way to gather information between bin Laden and other leaders of al-Qaeda? And was there any way to kind of just get inside the courier network that was clearly getting bin Laden's messages to various people? And it turned out that they could never intercept any messages going to Al Jazeera or any other media organization, or if they did intercept them, they could never trace the chain of custody past a certain number of cutouts along the way. Bin Laden's immediate family was with him, so he had no need to communicate with them, or at least some of his immediate family was always with him, so he didn't need to, he was just talking to them, and he wasn't communicating with the other family members in Saudi Arabia at all. They never intercepted anything that led them to bin Laden through the other leadership communications, so it left them with the courier network, and this is where the story becomes more complicated, because the question was who was the courier. And that took, and when I tell you what the process is, there are gaps in the story that I don't know the answer to, and I'm sure we'll find out more over time. The beginning of the story begins with this guy, Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, which is, he would turn out to be the courier. Now, how was Ahmed al-Kuwaiti identified? It's a story that begins 9 years before bin Laden is killed. The real 20th hijacker wasn't Zacchaeus Moussaoui in Minnesota, who was practicing flying planes and was detained because of his suspicious behavior at a flight school before 9/11. The real 20th hijacker was a guy called Mohammed al-Qahtani, who was arrested in Orlando. No, sorry, he wasn't arrested. He arrived at Orlando Airport in the summer of 2001. Waiting for him in the parking lot was Mohammed Atta, the leader of the hijackers. And an immigration officer didn't buy Mohammed al-Qahtani's explanation for why he was in the United States. He barely spoke English. He was on a one-way ticket. He didn't have any good explanation about what he was planning to do. The immigration officer sent him back to his native Saudi Arabia. From there, he went to Afghanistan. He was at the Battle of Tora Bora. He fled into Pakistan. He was arrested in late December of 2001, and he was sent to Guantanamo. In Guantanamo, he said that he was in Afghanistan because of his pressing interest in falconry, which of course wasn't true. And he then, at a certain point in the summer of 2002, the fingerprints of the guy who'd been sent back from Orlando Airport and the guy who claimed he was interested in falconry turned out to be the same person. So he then became the subject of a great deal of law enforcement and other interest at Guantanamo, and he was subjected to a course of coercive interrogations that, in the words of Susan Crawford, who was a federal judge appointed by Ronald Reagan and then became the head of the commissions at Guantanamo under George W. Bush at that time, she said that his treatment amounted to torture and he could never be tried for anything, and in fact he won't be. So what happened to him in the days that he was coercively interrogated? He was basically kept up for about 40+ days, and all of this is detailed in a Time magazine piece, which they got hold of his interrogation logs. He was kept up for 40 days at least. He was subjected to extremes of hot and cold. He was forced to perform dog tricks. He sometimes stripped naked in the presence of females. If he was falling asleep, he was given loud doses of particularly annoying tracks by Christina Aguilera. He was basically, anyway, so he was definitely coercively interrogated. Now, this is not clear when this happened, and according to a 6,000-page report, which the Senate Intelligence Committee is sitting on, still hasn't been declassified in any shape or form. We may have better answers when this report comes out in an unclassified form, but either before, during, or after this, he said that the person who was kind of teaching him about security within al-Qaeda was a guy called Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, and that this guy was clearly part of the inner circle of al-Qaeda. Now, Ahmed al-Kuwaiti is not a particularly useful clue because it means the father of Ahmed from Kuwait, and there are millions of Kuwaitis. Many of them have kids called Ahmed. However, it was the beginning of what would eventually lead to the courier. So fast forward to, actually in 2004, a guy called Hassan Gul, who's an al-Qaeda courier sent from bin Laden to the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, basically telling him to kind of stop his campaign against Iraqi civilians and Shia in particular, is picked up in Kurdistan, and according to a CIA officer who was in charge of the hunt for Zarqawi, during his time in Kurdish custody, he said that this guy Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti not only was important in al-Qaeda, but was one of bin Laden's couriers. Fast forward another 3 years to 2007, somehow the United States found out that Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti's real name was Ibrahim Saeed. Now, Ibrahim Saeed wasn't a Kuwaiti, he was actually a Pakistani, complicating things. He was a Pakistani who grew up in Kuwait, just like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Now, if you're a Pakistani living in Kuwait, Kuwait will never give you citizenship. So these were second-generation Pakistanis who had grown up in Kuwait, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11, and this guy Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. And they knew each other. And they were part of the sort of inner circle of al-Qaeda. Ibrahim Saeed, a Pakistani, is sort of a John Smith name in Pakistan, a country of almost 200 million people. But we're beginning to have the point where we now have a real name with the actual country where he's from, but there's no sense that this is bin Laden's courier. There's a sense that this guy is maybe bin Laden, a courier of bin Laden, maybe important. Sometime in the summer of 2010, probably with the help of the Pakistanis, perhaps inadvertent help, a phone call from somebody that they believe to be the courier takes place to somebody in the Gulf who they're tracking, who they believe to be at least perhaps part of al-Qaeda. The content of the conversation leads them to believe that the courier, whether we call him Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti or Ibrahim Saeed, his real name, is still part of al-Qaeda, and he's making phone calls from Peshawar, Pakistan. That's still a very long way from finding him in Abbottabad, because Peshawar is 2.5 hours drive from Abbottabad, and he turns his phone off. Not only turns his phone off, he also takes the battery out at least an hour away from where he lives. So you can't track a phone with the battery taken out, even if you're the NSA. So that requires basically putting people into Peshawar to track this guy when he is making phone calls in Peshawar, and either put a tracking device on his vehicle or physically follow him back to his house in Abbottabad where he's living, which happens in the summer of 2010. The house that the courier is living in is interesting because it doesn't have internet or phone service. The people there are burning their trash. They're also lying to their neighbors about who they are. They're in fact even lying to their own family members about who they are, about what they're doing and where they're living. And there is 3 families living in this house, one family taking exceptional efforts to avoid going out or being surveyed in any way. At that point, Leon Panetta, the CIA director, goes to Barack Obama in August of 2010, basically tells him, we have a very good lead on this house that suggests bin Laden could be there. There are no high fives in the Oval Office, and there's probably a group of maybe 5 or 6 people who know at this point in the White House. Tom Donilon, Dennis McDonough, the Vice President's National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, John Brennan, the President's counterterrorism advisor, and that's really it. At the beginning, Tom Donilon has said there's one way to keep a secret in Washington: don't tell anybody, and that, of course, is true. And they were very, very careful about any kind. They were very, very careful with this information. And there were some people in the White House who noticed there were meetings that were happening. They're actually called non-meetings, which meetings where you don't bring. There are no read-ahead papers. You can't bring a second. The cameras in the Situation Room are turned off. And there were a number of these non-meetings that began happening with greater frequency over time. And in these meetings, there was a discussion about the intelligence, the quality of the intelligence, about whether bin Laden was there. And, there was a range of, it was a circumstantial case that bin Laden was living there, where they never got a picture of bin Laden, they never got a satellite image, there was nobody who said, there was no cook who worked at the house who said, I just saw, a 6'4" Arab guy looking a lot like bin Laden. There was nothing like that. And Panetta was quite frustrated and kept pushing for better information. At one point, he said, well, if we can't get a picture of bin Laden, maybe we can get a picture, we can measure his shadow and get a sense of how tall he is, since we know he's 6'4". So the National Geospatial Imagery measured his shadow and came back and said it's a man between 5'3" and 6'8". Jeremy Bash, who was Leon Panetta's chief of staff, went to the bin Laden unit and said, you know, the boss really wants you to be creative here and come up with 25 ideas. They can be as crazy as you want that show that you are thinking creatively about how we can get better information or a photograph or something out of this house. So they came up with, I think, 38 ideas, some of which are clearly, you know, were fanciful, one of which was to throw stink bombs into the compound and flush people out. Another one was to broadcast in Arabic the voice of Allah commanding the inhabitants of the compound to leave. And then another one which did happen, which was both creative and ethically dubious, which was to mount a vaccination campaign in Abbottabad, which would basically recruit a Pakistani doctor, have a hepatitis B vaccination campaign be conducted. The doctor was recruited, he got some nurses, he began the campaign in a poor part of town so it wouldn't arouse any suspicion, and the idea was that they would get into the bin Laden neighborhood, which was more of a middle class, upper middle class neighborhood, get DNA from one of the kids, match it to existing DNA of the bin Laden family in the United States, and, you know, bingo. But that never happened. And of course, this was a very dumb idea in Pakistan, because in Pakistan, as you know, it's one of the very few countries where polio has not been eradicated, and polio workers are regarded as agents of the CIA by elements of the Taliban. And this program, I think, has certainly endangered health workers in Pakistan, because it seems to confirm a Pakistani conspiracy theory that vaccination programs are conducted by the CIA, because in this case it was. So none of this really amounted to much in terms of trying to get better intelligence. The CIA was basically faced with a catch-22, which was the way to get better intelligence was to be more visible on the target, to, you know, do more obvious surveillance, more people knocking on the door, and basically that might have spooked the target, which they did not want to do. And so the circumstantial case, hanging over this all was the weapons of mass destruction fiasco in Iraq, which was a circumstantial case that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And since then, the agency's been more careful about, has a whole sort of set of protocols to come up with alternative explanations for the same set of information. So when people looked at the evidence for bin Laden living in this compound, they also came up with alternative explanations. Could this be somebody in Al-Qaeda who was retired? Could this be another person in Al-Qaeda? Could this be a drug dealer that recruited a member of Al-Qaeda to act as a courier? Could this be bin Laden's family without him? The list was fairly long for alternative explanations. And at a certain point, Mike Morrell, the deputy director of the CIA, briefed President Obama and kind of told him everything I've just told you, essentially. And Obama said, look, why are you at 60% probability that bin Laden is in this compound, and other of your analysts are at 80%? And Morrell said, look, I lived through the Iraq weapons of mass destruction fiasco. I'm very leery, as are many people who lived through that, of a circumstantial case. And in fact, Mr. President, the circumstantial case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction is a better circumstantial case than bin Laden living in this compound. So that is a pretty, if I was the president, that would give me a great deal of pause. And, you know, I think this will be, just as President Kennedy's decisions in the Cuban Missile Crisis is kind of a case study of presidential decision-making, coming in a very difficult situation, coming up with the best possible solution. I think that historians will look back on this very similarly, because you're making decisions based on imperfect information. And it's very easy for an analyst to say there's a 40% chance that bin Laden's in Abbottabad or at 80%. But when you make the decision, he's either 100% not there or he's 100% there. There's no 40% chance that he's there. And you have to, at the end of the day, you have to make a decision. And in our system, you make the decision alone. And 5 days after my book first came out, Mitt Romney said that any president, including Jimmy Carter, would have made this decision. And I didn't know when I was writing the book that that would be one of the responses that people would have to this issue. And, you know, President Carter did make a form of this decision. It substantially contributed to the fact that he was a one-term president. And hanging over all the discussions in the National Security Council meetings was a Democratic president who'd authorized a risky special operations operation on the other side of the world in a country that that was inimical to American interests, and that had contributed to basically his one-term presidency. And every time there was a meeting, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who had started working for the Nixon White House when President Obama was 12, would make the following point, that I was in the White House that night that operation went down. He was the executive assistant to CIA Director Stansfield Turner, a 41-year-old CIA officer. As you know, everything that could go wrong with this operation did go wrong. The helicopters and AC-130s crashed. 7 American servicemen died. It was a huge fiasco. And it was, by the way, an entirely predictable fiasco, because each of the elements of the armed services wanted to be involved in this big, important operation: the Marines, the Army, the Air Force. And they had never rehearsed this kind of operation together. I sat next to then Vice President Hubert Humphrey recently at a lunch in Minneapolis, and I was asking him about this operation. He said one of the big problems about the operation, everything was so top secret that a lot of people involved didn't really understand how the operation all fit together. And the reason I mention all this is Joint Special Operations Command, which is the command that did the bin Laden raid, came out of that fiasco in the Iranian desert in 1980. There was a realization you couldn't do these operations unless there was, people continuously practiced together and understood how each other worked. So Joint Special Operations Command was founded coming out of the defeat of the disaster Operation Desert Storm, Desert One, Operation Eagle Claw, sometimes it's referred to. And it was Joint Special Operations Command that did the bin Laden raid. Now, the evolution of JSOC, as it's referred to, is an interesting story, because this was, JSOC was really a counter-terrorist organization, but was never deployed before 9/11 to go after bin Laden or al-Qaeda. And why was that? Well, paradoxically, or maybe not paradoxically, the Pentagon was extremely reluctant to authorize any kind of mission in Afghanistan. Steve Cole, my friend and colleague, in his book Ghost Wars, quotes President Clinton basically saying, wouldn't it scare al-Qaeda if the black ninjas sort of came down in their camps and sort of did their thing? And what happened with the conventional army was very suspicious of special operations forces, particularly in the wake of the Battle of Mogadishu, where 18 American servicemen were killed in 1993. And every time an operation was sort of suggested of this kind, they would basically keep heavying it up, meaning suggesting more and more people involved. So politically it became untenable. Suddenly it looked like the invasion of Afghanistan, when it really needed to be a small team to go in and basically take out bin Laden before 9/11. Anyway, suffice it to say that never happened. So Joint Special Operations Command, ironically, which was essentially a counterterrorism force, was never used before 9/11. And it really became, it sort of came to its kind of potential during the Iraq War. General Stanley McChrystal turned that organization into, I quote him in the book saying basically, I needed to turn a bookstore into Amazon. And what he meant by that was to, instead of an organization that did maybe 1 or 2 operations a month, suddenly it was doing 300 operations a month. And so President Obama was very comfortable with the abilities of Joint Special Operations. One of the very first decisions he made in office was the decision to authorize deadly force in the case of Captain Richard Phillips in Somalia, the subject of the Tom Hanks film. And this was a flawless military operation. After President Obama authorized the use of deadly force, Captain Phillips was on the boat for 5 days. There was a moment where his life seemed to be in danger. 3 Navy SEALs, as night fell, at a distance of 30 yards in heaving seas, shot each of these 3 pirates with 1 shot each. So kind of a spectacular military feat that surely would have impressed President Obama, and certainly impressed him about the abilities of Admiral Bill McRaven, the head of JSOC, who was the architect of the bin Laden operation. So the military component was not something that President Obama had to worry overly much about. The same night that the bin Laden raid went down, there were 12 other operations in Afghanistan with Joint Special Operations Command, some of which would have been technically more difficult. But he did have to worry about a lot of other things. And the big thing, of course, he had to worry about was the reaction of the Pakistanis. As the intelligence picture didn't really improve, there came a point where you have to say, what are we going to do about it? We know the intelligence isn't going to improve, so what are we going to do, if anything? And it really came down to 5 choices, one of which was, let's do a joint operation with the Pakistanis. Now, that had happened in the past. The arrest of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11, was a joint U.S.-Pakistan relations operation. But relations between the two countries were at their nadir. You may recall Raymond Davis, a U.S. CIA contractor, killed 2 Pakistanis in broad daylight, January 28th, 2011. We, the United States government, President Obama, said all sorts of misleading things about who he was, that he was a State Department official, diplomatic cover, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it turned out he was a CIA contractor, which was pretty obvious because this was a guy who, basically took out 2 people with 2 shots, had, was huge bulging muscles, didn't look like a diplomat, and of course, so that again confirmed a Pakistani conspiracy theory that their country is just awash in CIA folks going around killing Pakistanis, and so the relations were bad, and there was concerns that a U.S.-Pakistani operation, the details would leak. Another idea was to drop to bomb the compound. When people looked at what it would take, it was a B-52 raid. To destroy this compound would require 32 500-pound bombs. James Cartwright, who was President Obama's favorite general by Bob Woodward's description, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, pointed out that this would be like having an earthquake going off in a fairly large Pakistani city. You couldn't prove to yourself if you killed bin Laden, you'd be bombing an ally, there'd be civilian casualties. If this was dismissed out of hand fairly quickly. Another idea which had a number of adherents was to use a drone strike using a small experimental drone. No one would tell me what exactly that was, but I could tell from the way that people described it that this was not something that the U.S. Air Force was using. And as I looked into it, it looked like something that Raytheon had developed, a 9-pound bomb. The smallest bomb the U.S. Air Force drops is 500 pounds. So a 9-pound bomb. It had never been used in combat before. Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was very skeptical of this idea, relying on technology. The experimental drone had a number of advantages as an idea. One, if you did the drone strike, whoever was in this compound wasn't going to complain about it. They were clearly trying to keep a very low profile. So it would probably be pretty deniable. But there were also problems with it. You couldn't pick up any intelligence with the drone strike at the compound. You might miss the target. People survived drone strikes, so there were a number of people who thought it was a good idea, a number of people who didn't. There was, of course, the U.S. Navy SEALs, boots on the ground idea, and there was also the very tempting human idea about let's just wait and see if we can get anything better about the intelligence before we make a decision, and let's just defer this decision as long as possible. But there were costs even in delay, because the longer you delay, the more people are knowing about what's going on, or they know something's going on. So once you start operationalizing a military operation like SEALs on a Navy SEAL operation, you have to have people practicing the operation. They practiced in North Carolina for a month in April. Then they had a much bigger rehearsal in Nevada, and more people are finding out about this. And there are concerns about leaks, and in fact, you have to bring in people who are going to deal with the leaks. So Ben Rhodes was brought in because there were concerns. We may need to talk to newspaper editors to tell him or her, why not to hold this story. They brought in George Little, who was he's just stepped down as the head of public affairs at the Pentagon, who was the head of public affairs at CIA. Basically, we need also to think about how we explain this to the American people if it goes wrong. And so they produced a 66-page unclassified version of the intelligence that they could explain to everybody in the event that the operation didn't work. Anyway, so more and more people are finding out. There are 5 National Security Council meetings to discuss the issue. The last meeting is on April the 28th, 2011. During the meeting, President Obama goes around the table and asks people for their opinions. Some of he already knows the opinions of some. Bob Gates, the defense secretary, says, basically, I'm against. Not only is this circumstantial evidence, and I've seen too many he was, of course, a former director of the CIA himself. I've seen too many circumstantial cases fall apart. What happens if the Pakistanis close off our supply routes to Afghanistan, which every 90% of, at that time, of the materiel going to US and NATO troops is transiting Pakistani airspace or Pakistani land. And reminded everybody about the Operation Desert One. Senator Joe Biden, who'd become a senator when President Obama was 13, also said that he was against the raid for all the reasons I've just outlined, and he was also concerned about an attack on the U.S. Embassy in 1979. An enraged Pakistani mob had burnt the embassy to the ground, concerned about that kind of reaction. And of course, SEALs being, there was a concern that you could have 24 Raymond Davises who were suddenly in Pakistani prisons, or a firefight with the Pakistani military and civilian casualties. James Cartwright, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, advocated for the experimental drone strike. On the other side of the issue, Admiral Mike Mullen had attended the final rehearsal in Nevada, the full dress rehearsal where they flew in for an hour to the target at night, did the raid, and flew out again for another hour. He was in favor, he shaked every hand of the SEALs involved. He had a great faith in Admiral McRaven. He was in favor of the raid. And that's unusual where the vice chairman and the chairman have essentially two different pieces of military advice for the president. Leon Panetta was always in favor of the raid. And Hillary Clinton, who of course was senator from New York on September 11th and visited Ground Zero on September 12th, gave a long and lawyerly exposition of both the pros and the cons of everything that was being suggested, and then came down on the raid as well. And so at 7 o'clock the meeting is finished. President Obama goes back to his quarters at the White House, and at 8:20 the following morning comes out and authorizes the mission, tells Tom Donald and Dennis McDonough it's a go. We all know how it turned out. As I mentioned, I was the only person to get into the compound to get a look at it, and it was useful to also reconstruct what happened the night of the raid, because there's physical evidence you can see about what the SEALs did that night that I was able to see, for instance, which doors they blew through. They had to blow through a huge 20-foot door on the ground floor to get to the second and third floors where bin Laden lived. There was also a very large door on the third floor preventing entrance into bin Laden's bedroom. They didn't blow through that because bin Laden had sort of poked his head out and was either confused or sort of in a hurry and didn't close it behind him. Bin Laden had 15 minutes to surrender. A helicopter had crash landed in his house, which was a pretty loud event. He had told his wives, we now know the Americans have arrived. So he knew that the jig was up. If he had conspicuously surrendered, it would have been a war crime to shoot him, as it would be in any U.S. military operation. He didn't surrender. He had 2 guns in his room. He didn't reach for them. He may have been paralyzed by indecision, fear, surprise. Who knows? Clearly, he didn't expect this to happen. He didn't have a plan B. He didn't. There was no safe room in the house. There was no tunnel out. The CIA was concerned there might be a tunnel out, but when they looked at the water table, it's very high in that part of the country, and there was no way there could be a tunnel. He may have been concerned about having a firefight in an enclosed space with his wives and kids around him. Anyway, the point is he put up no resistance. And what was very interesting to me was his death was greeted by basically indifference in the Muslim world. I think bin Laden by then had basically his moment had sort of come and gone. His claim that Al-Qaeda represents, is defending Muslims, I think had been very largely undercut by Al-Qaeda's activities in Iraq, something he himself understood, because this is a group that killed literally tens of thousands of Muslim civilians during the Iraq War in suicide attacks, and he had become irrelevant. Now, did that mean that it wasn't important to capture or kill him? Of course not. For the victims of 9/11, their families, for the restoration of American national honor, I think these were all very important, to finally find him. And when it happened, I was on CNN, and Wolf Blitzer asked me immediately after the president stopped talking, "What's your reaction?" And I obviously didn't have any time to rehearse this because I didn't know that would be his question. I didn't even know that bin Laden was dead necessarily until the president confirmed it. And I said, the war on terror is over. We can basically announce that. And by that I didn't mean that terrorism was over, but I meant the war on terror, capital W, capital T, is over. At the end of the day, if the Taliban had handed over bin Laden, we wouldn't have been in Afghanistan, and we wouldn't have been in Iraq, in my view. I think history would have been very different. And bin Laden, 9/11 was his strategic idea. I believe in a very old-fashioned view of history, which is, certain people change history. And it's very hard to explain why the French were at the gates of Moscow in 1812 without Napoleon and an understanding of his personality and ego. I think it's very hard to explain the Holocaust without Hitler. And I think it's impossible to explain 9/11 without bin Laden, because it was his strategic conception. And it was his, he had a very naive idea about the United States, is that we would, if we were subjected to enough violent pressure, that we would pull out of the Middle East. Quite the reverse happened. He based that, and he told this to me when we interviewed him in 1997, that the United States is a paper tiger, and they're like the former Soviet Union. They fear death, and we love, we love death, and these kinds of sloganeerings. He misunderstood completely what the American reaction would be to 9/11, and we all thought of it at the time as sort of like Pearl Harbor. Yes, it was very like Pearl Harbor. It was a great tactical victory for al-Qaeda, which led ineluctably to their strategic defeat, just as Pearl Harbor was a great tactical victory for the Japanese, but within 4 years caused the collapse of Imperial Japan. Al-Qaeda means the base in Arabic. They lost the best base they ever had as a result of 9/11. I have Afghan friends who were watching 9/11 as it happened, and they were, happy is the wrong word, they were cognizant of the fact that they could be liberated from the Taliban because of this attack. If you do the thought experiment where there's no 9/11, there's no reason why the Taliban wouldn't be in control of Afghanistan today. So the whole thing was a strategic failure for bin Laden, and I think al-Qaeda, the organization that attacked us on 9/11, is on life support, which of course doesn't mean that there won't be people inspired by bin Laden's message, as we saw in Boston. If you look at what Jahar Tsarnaev was scrawling in the boat just before he thought he was going to be killed, he basically was scrawling a version of bin Laden's principal message, which was the United States, the West, led by the United States, is at war with Islam, and we need to kind of take revenge on the US. And that very simple message will have resonance with, at least a very small minority of young men, because almost invariably they're young men. And bin Laden's message will live on. But I think there are fewer and fewer takers for the message. Al-Qaeda in Syria is certainly a big concern because they seem to have learned from the mistakes that Al-Qaeda in Iraq had. But I think the long-term prognosis for this group and this ideology is pretty poor. So with that, I'll take any questions.
More water if you want. So, questions? Yes. Yes. There's a microphone, I think, right over there. Just make sure, because there are a lot of people in the room, so it's probably worth walking over to the microphone.
Hi, Mr. Bergen. First of all, thank you for your time. Second of all, you just mentioned this quote that I wanted to question you about. Declared the global war of terror over after bin Laden died. How would you characterize what's going on right now? You have a new Taliban leader in Pakistan. You have this stuff going on in Yemen, Somalia, all over. What would be your characterization of what's going on right now?
Yeah, one way of answering that is on May 23rd, President Obama gave a speech at the National Defense University, which I think was a very important speech. It was the first really big speech about answering the question you've just asked. He's done speeches about Guantanamo, he's done speeches about elements of this, but this was his first big speech about national security, counterterrorism. And what he wanted, I think, during that speech was to begin a discussion about, do we want to be in a permanent state of war? Does the United States want to be in a permanent state of war? Which, by the way, I don't think is something that is a particularly American concept. and I don't think it's pretty either, and isn't a particularly desirable one. And wars shouldn't go on forever. That doesn't mean that the threat from Al-Qaeda is going to be zero, but it does mean that we should, the threat from Al-Qaeda is clearly receded. As you mentioned, there's a new leader of the Pakistani Taliban, which is certainly very bad news for Pakistan, but is kind of probably not a huge issue for the United States once we remove combat troops from Afghanistan. Now, the president, who after all is a constitutional law professor, in this speech talked about the authorization for the use of military force, which is the congressional authorization to use military force after 9/11, which authorized the war in Afghanistan. Now, nobody voting for that, and it passed with only one no vote at the time, realized that this was going to authorize America's longest war, that it was going to authorize military operations in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and potentially any other place in the world where Al-Qaeda or its allies exist. And I think that the president was trying to say in this speech that we need to have a discussion about sort of winding this down. And that doesn't mean that if Hillary Clinton is president, or if Jeb Bush is president, or whoever is president in 2016, that they wouldn't be able to take action, military action, against forces within Al-Qaeda that pose an imminent threat to the United States. Because after all, Bill Clinton did that with the embassy attacks in 1998. He didn't need an authorization of war authorization to go after bin Laden's camps in '98 in Afghanistan. So I think the president was right to start having that conversation, and the reason that he started this conversation now rather than in December 2014 when U.S. combat troops leave Afghanistan is that it takes a long time to change things in Washington. Arguably, things will never change, but I think it's the right discussion to be having. Of course, there would be certain outcomes of such a decision. If we said we're no longer in a state of war, what do we do with the 40-plus people in Guantanamo who have not been charged with a crime but are regarded as being too dangerous to release? Since right now they're held under the laws of war, what do you do with them? To what extent would this impact the U.S. drone program? Because many of the authorizations that authorize the program, particularly in Pakistan, are associated with the authorization for the use of military force. So, it's not going to be an easy discussion, but I think it's certainly a worthwhile one.
You write about in the book the time that bin Laden is in Afghanistan and his sort of seemingly tenuous relationship with Mullah Omar. And I just wanted to ask you, maybe you can kind of expound on it a little bit more. It seems really interesting because you write how right after 9/11, bin Laden seems a little nervous about taking responsibility because he doesn't want to put Mullah Omar in this position of, oh, what do we do with this guy? Do we give him up or not? But at the same time, Omar had talked about, even before 9/11, okay, we're not going to give him up and, we're going to protect him. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how their relationship really worked and if it was respect or if it was just Omar trying to protect his own interests. And
yeah, I mean, let's start with let's start with Mullah Omar, who is still with us somewhere. Mullah Omar is a village mullah. And by the way, in Afghan sort of social hierarchy, that was a very, very low position to have historically. A deeply unsophisticated guy. When in the 5 years that he ran Afghanistan, he only visited Kabul, the capital, twice. He stayed in Kandahar. When a visiting delegation of Chinese diplomats came to give him a gift, it was a figurine, he reacted in horror as if they'd sort of, attacked his wife because he's, the whole concept of an animal figurine was reprehensible to him. So I think Mullah Omar was a very unsophisticated guy who kind of got lucky, and his relationship with bin Laden, was based on he respected bin Laden's the fact that bin Laden fought during the Afghan war. But bin Laden didn't really respect him in any meaningful way because he didn't clue him in about. I mean, bin Laden led to the fall of the Taliban regime, and basically lied about what he was doing. So I think their relationship was, bin Laden just sort of manipulated Mullah Omar. And if you look back, in fact, in some ways, the dress rehearsal, the fact that Mullah Omar destroyed the great Buddha statues in Bamiyan, which have been there for 1,500 years, this was definitely, those statues have been there for 1,500 years, including the 700 or 800 years that Afghanistan's been a Muslim country. No one has paid any, no one's touched them. So it was really the sort of Wahhabi bin Laden ideas that led to their destruction.
Yes, you're one of the few people that met with bin Laden, a journalist that met with bin Laden. After the official interview or before, were you able to somehow speak with the individual? Was he able to deal with you as a person, or it was just business and that's it?
It was mostly business. A friend of mine made a film based on this book for HBO, and he found footage that I didn't know existed, which is sort of kind of it was footage that was shot before and after the interview, and it shows bin Laden relaxing and having a cup of tea, and he's sort of kicking back and he's sort of laughing a little bit. But we didn't have a substantial interaction. We had a cup of tea with him, and it wasn't a sort of warm and fuzzy meeting. It wasn't hostile either. He was there to do his interview, and we were there to film it. My reaction to him was, he seemed well-informed and intelligent, serious. The people around him seemed serious. A lot of them spoke English. They were educated. Some of them didn't speak in English. Their sort of guards seemed to be from a different social class, but a lot of the people who were dealing with us were quite educated. It was an hour and a half in his company. It was not, wasn't time to really assess what he's like personally. I did then spend many years talking to his friends and family about him, colleagues, acquaintances. And, a fairly universal picture emerges, which is this guy is fairly humble, never raised his voice, didn't seem like he'd be much of a leader. In meetings when he was in his 20s, he'd barely, he'd be in a room for hours without saying anything. And so what changed, I think the big change is that I think when he went into Afghanistan in 1985, he started fighting the Soviets personally. I think that changed him. He took a lot of risks. He subjected the people he was with to a lot of risk. These were 21-year-old, 22-year-old Saudi university graduates. None of them had an idea about how to fight. And they came there to die. They didn't come there to fight, in a way. But I think that experience changed him, and by the time he was about 30, he founded Al-Qaeda in 1988. He was 29. And by then he had sort of the courage of his own convictions. And a lot of people told him, his old friends started leaving him around this time, saying, you don't have any military expertise. Why you you shouldn't be involved in recruiting people for a military organization. So I think that experience seems to be something that's made him change. Yeah.
I need the mic.
So one frivolous question and one reasonably serious. I thought that when he was captured, there was a cache of porn, so that he was watching Peter Bergen on CNN and doing what with his porn. So, but it's not mentioned, and I just wondered whether that was totally apocryphal up there on the third floor of the compound.
Yeah, I think that was a very rare instance of effective information operations by the CIA.
I see, they put it out.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't think that doesn't fit with him.
No, I know, it was odd. Just about torture. I mean, you show, and you talked in your presentation, but also in the book, about how Operation Greystone started right after 9/11, authorized by Bush, and just one person after another, everybody was tortured. And these coercive, and you described some of them just now, but the role of torture in the process of the hunt for bin Laden is extraordinary. And I guess sort of what do you think about that? But also, it would be according to your narrative, unimaginable that they would have caught him without torturing everybody along the way who led to some clues that eventually ended up in the compound.
I'm very sorry if I gave you that impression. Because that was not, I mean, I try to sort this out in the book to the best of my ability, and, you know, much of the information is not, you know, that you need to make a final determination is in public. And I mentioned the 6,000-page report that the Senate Intelligence Committee, they've, I think, looked at 6 million documents. It's been a 3-year process. I mean, and it's led by Senator Dianne Feinstein, and she's been fairly clear, along with Senator Chuck Levin, who's also part of the task force, that coercive interrogation, I use the term coercive interrogation in the book rather than torture, because I think torture is vague and means a lot of different things to different people. But no one could deny that people were coercively interrogated. They say that coercive interrogations did not lead to bin Laden, and I think that's a pretty defensible statement. Certainly, people in the book who gave up information about bin Laden were coercively interrogated. The question is, when did they give the information up? And until we have the actual chronology, that's going to be a hard thing to answer. But the people that I mentioned in the book, it's quite possible that they gave up information before they were coercively interrogated. In fact, and we know, look, Abu Zubaydah, who was the first main al-Qaeda leader, he gave up Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the operational commander of 9/11 to Ali Soufan long before he was coercively interrogated. So it's true that a lot of people in the book are coercively interrogated. The question is, how useful was it? And a lot of and if you look at all the kind of leads that came from the book, that got you to bin Laden, many of the leads came from very traditional things that had nothing to do with interrogation. So how did we find the real name? Ibrahim Saeed that he was a Pakistani. I mean, I don't have a definitive answer for that, but I presume the Pakistanis gave it to us because they would be in a position to know. How do we track down the phone call in the summer of 2011 that indicated that this guy was still part of al-Qaeda? It was the National Security Agency, not interrogation. How did we find the compound in Abbottabad? We had spies on the ground. People were recruited who followed him back. So the book, in fact, the hunt for bin Laden involved every imaginable intelligence technique, including interrogations, some perhaps coercive and some not. And it was a sum of all these things that led to bin Laden, including, I think, just some really good deductive reasoning to think about how do you find somebody who's taking these efforts not to be found. One of the things I look at in the book, and that the CIA also looked at, is what were the lessons of other manhunts that you could apply to this? And they were not exact, but you know, how did the Israelis find Eichmann was a big, interesting question. And that involved Eichmann's son had a girlfriend, and he was kind of bragging about what his dad did in the war to the girlfriend's dad, and the girlfriend's dad had a friend who was a prosecutor of former Nazis in Germany, and somehow the Mossad got hold of the content of that conversation and, of course, kidnapped Eichmann. So I think in all these cases, you know, there's usually a variety of methods that get people caught. I knew, you know, bin Laden was a human being, and he was going to get caught eventually because he wanted to be in control. If he stopped communicating with anybody, he'd still be alive today.
Sorry. Thanks so much for being here, Peter. Your book is read like a breathtaking thriller, and but at the end of the day, as an academician, we tend to kill those kind of stories and parse them. And I found myself thinking along the same lines as Chuck. I wanted to ask about torture, but if we take the Manhunt, and now I'm going to devoid it of any fictional or any like really storytelling interest, and just look at it as a case study in counterterrorism. Just because it is very visible, very well executed, very well detailed. Then we have the question of the torture that Chuck stole. And then there is the idea of al-Kuwaiti it was by some sort of a surveillance that Al-Kuwaiti was, discovered. And I'm thinking, one of the things that I was thinking reading it is, how much would that contact be within an NSA, larger circle versus the NSA more, how much would that contact be considered a civilian rather than a known terrorist? That's one thing. The other is, and so on and so forth. There are many other things. So we have the question of torture. We have the question of surveillance. I also had another point that I forget from just now. Oh, and and how much was it worth to? One of the things that really is disappointing is the breach of trust with the vaccination. I mean, the WHO severely protested this.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, starting from the back of those questions, I mean, the Pakistan, I mean, as I think I indicated in the talk, I think it's that was creative but ethically dubious and very counterproductive. It didn't work, and it's created an environment where polio workers are being killed by the Taliban with the justification that these are agents of the CIA. So,
How extensive was the vaccination? How many people were vaccinated?
I don't know. I mean, I went to Abbottabad and I went to hospitals where people were familiar with. I mean, it was, no one would talk about people. Pakistan, the intelligence agencies are very. It was a difficult reporting environment, but clearly, I think they vaccinated a neighborhood of kids at least, and maybe two. And they recruited a number of nurses. So it was and by the way, this guy is no hero. I mean, so there's a narrative on the right that this guy helped find bin Laden. That's total nonsense. President Obama said he didn't tell his own wife about this. I find that a little hard to believe, being married myself, but but I think that he certainly didn't tell Valerie Jarrett there was nobody in the White House nobody knew. So in the same way, why would this Pakistani doctor they recruited wasn't told, hey, you're part of a plan to find Osama bin Laden. He was told, we are paying you like a few $1,000s to run this false vaccination program, or in fact, it was a real vaccination program in Abbottabad. All you need to know is that we're paying you and we're the CIA, and that's it. So this guy is no hero. He's in prison for 33 years on unrelated charges of supporting the Taliban. And when people say, well, this guy should be out of prison, I used to have a two-word answer, which is Jonathan Pollard, who's a Israeli, spying for the Israelis, an American citizen, is still in U.S. prison, despite the efforts of the Israelis to get him out for decades now. So I agree with you that it was inexcusable. In the 1970s Church Commission, the CIA was no longer supposed to use journalists as cover or priests or these other things. So I think say what?
Peace Corps.
Peace Corps, all these things. So the question of NSA, I think, it's hard to tell, but I'm pretty confident, two things. First of all, the Pakistanis were helpful to the United States in finding in this arena, because they told me that they were looking at a network of people within Al-Qaeda who were speaking, one particular person who was speaking both in Arabic and Pashto, which is sort of unusual, and that they were helping with this. And I think that's very plausible. So that's not an NSA bulk surveillance type thing. That's a liaison relationship with another intelligence agency. I don't think this is not bulk surveillance. No one has a problem with the NSA spying on members of Al-Qaeda or people they have a belief are in Al-Qaeda. Where the issue arises is that's like looking for a particular needle, because the needle might be worth looking at. What people have a problem is creating a giant haystack that there may be a needle in someday. I mean, that's where the problem arises. And I'm pretty confident that bulk surveillance had nothing to do with this operation. But, it's hard to make these judgments with without the actual information.
Just to summarize,
yeah.
One of the conclusions of your book would be that the current counterterrorism policy, including the use of torture, use of Guantanamo Bay, use of the irregular warfare kind of mandate that the U.S. has taken to themselves, were all
Well, yes and no. I mean, look, my book is not a series of lessons learned. It's a narrative, as you point out. And I mean, and you know, there's a reason that narratives work, because we're sort of programmed to find them interesting. And life is complex, but also, well, no, but I think more than that. I mean, look, I don't think, you know, the two of the greatest historians of the English-speaking world were Gibbon and Macaulay, both of whom wrote very well and wrote stories that people found interesting. It didn't mean that the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire was a bad book, nor did it mean that the History of England by Macaulay was a bad book. So I don't think that there is a necessary distinction between something that is both accurate and useful and well written. But I wasn't attempting to. I was trying to let the reader make their own judgments, and you've made some judgments from it. I think if I was to interpret the book for somebody else, I would say that the evidence that coercive interrogation led to bin Laden is very thin. And I had a long exchange with the scriptwriter of Zero Dark 30 on this issue, and I wrote 6,000 words about it for CNN.com after the film came out, basically trying to lay out the case that the picture in the film that torture led to bin Laden just wasn't supported by the facts. But you know, I think, you know, the counter argument to what you've just said is that one of the big takeaways from the documents in the compound is how effective the CIA drone campaign had been on Al-Qaeda, according to bin Laden himself. So, you know, not all of these techniques. I mean, there's two different questions: efficacy and efficacy and ethics. And something can be, something can be unethical while it's efficacious. Something can be ethical and unefficacious. Something can be unethical and unefficacious. So the list goes on, and I think we'd have to get into a more detailed discussion about each of these issues. If bin Laden was answering your question, he would have said, you know, Guantanamo was a great recruiting tool for me. The drones have been very bad for my organization. So he would sort of have a mixed answer to your question.
Maybe you would say that killing him would be the best thing that the U.S. could do. Let's open it up.
Well, I mean, I want to go back to the question, was this the best thing that the United States could do, was to making him shaheed or martyred? And I was struck by the total absence of reaction to bin Laden's death. I mean, in Pakistan, you can have 1 million-man march at the drop of a hat, and in fact, the number of protests after bin Laden's death were minuscule. So people didn't have that reaction. And I can't, you know, we often talk about how, you know, a particular drone strike is going to create a martyr, or, I mean, if it didn't create a martyr out of bin Laden, you know, it's funny enough that the people that Al-Qaeda takes seriously as martyrs are people who are religious leaders, like Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman. But if you're a fighter who dies in the cause, you don't become a martyr. And then it doesn't become a great sort of cause.
I have two questions, and I think they're both pretty straightforward. You talked about the real 20th hijacker.
Yeah.
Are you able to talk a little bit about the background for why there's been sort of a generally held misperception about the identity of that 20th hijacker? And my second question is, in terms of the compound that you were able to see, and you talked about it today, and you talked about it in your book, that it was quite sparse and under the circumstances, maybe, you know, surprising in some ways, the beds that you described and how uncomfortable they presumably would be. Is your understanding of the reason for that, was it a strategic reason to remain, you know, out of suspicion, or was it limited resources, or was it more a matter of principle? I remember you talked about in the book bin Laden not wanting his family or associates to get used to luxury so that they could, you know, be prepared for life on the run.
I think it was, you know, bin Laden, like some children of very rich people, was also very careful with money, and he almost pathologically stingy. People would complain about how little he would be paying him, and also money was tight, and his personality was somebody he seemed to revel in living out like a sort of peasant. You know, when they were living in Tora Bora, which was his idea of vacation, they were living in a sort of small hovel. There was no electricity or heat. I mean, Tora Bora is really, I mean, it's like being in the foothills of the Rockies or something. It's very cold, and his family would complain, and he would take them on 12-mile hikes, which he seemed to just revel in. And so I think his personality was somebody who just didn't. He really rejected the. In Kandahar and in Sudan, two of the hottest places in the world, he didn't have air conditioning. He almost made a point of it. So I think it was his personality. And on the first question about the confusion about the 20th hijacker, I think because Zacchaeus Moussaoui was very quickly identified, it became a kind of media shorthand that he was a 20th hijacker. And of course, we now know that he was part of the second wave of planned attacks in the United States. And Mohammed al-Qahtani, who was the guy turned back in the summer of 2001, really was the 20th hijacker. And one of the reasons United Flight 93 didn't crash into the Capitol was because there were only 4 hijackers on the plane. I mean, as opposed to 5, which was true on every other plane. And Mohammed, the idea is Qahtani would have been a muscle hijacker on that plane. And luckily it didn't happen.
How do you feel about that? And,
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel very strongly about it at all, in the sense that people are, I don't think, I mean, that's just the American way, I think, and it's Zero Dark 30, I think, the reason that I could write 6,000 words critiquing it as a work of history is they claimed that it was a work of history. That, often if you look at a Hollywood film, it says, inspired by real events, but it didn't say, they didn't make the claim that this was based on their own reporting and blah, 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 which was true, but you can't have it both ways. It's either a work of history or it's a work of entertainment, and they try to have it both ways, and when they were critiqued as a work of history, they said, well, it's a film, not a documentary. So I think they opened themselves to a legitimate question about how accurate was this, and the idea, by the way, that there was only one person in the CIA, this female played by Jessica Chastain, who really wanted to find bin Laden. I mean, clearly it doesn't pass any kind of common sense test. So, but, as a film, I think it's very effective. As a piece of history, it's not as good. But I don't think anybody going there is going to think, wow, this is how it really happened. Okay. Well, I think the account of what happened, the U.S. Navy SEAL raid on the house is, I think, very effective. There is one detail that is completely wrong, which is you can see what's going on, because in the film, I mean, you can't have a film that's entirely filmed in, at night. I mean, this was a moonless night. There was no electricity in the neighborhood, so they had to kind of fudge that slightly. But I think it's as an almost real-time account of what happened that night. It's very close to what happened.
My second question is, and this was touched on, even though it was for a very short period of time, you met the man, and you've spent a lot of time doing research about him.
He reminded me a tiny bit of you. If that was the question. Oh, sorry.
Cover my hair. What's left. In any event, my question is, based on your instinct, based on your knowledge, was this guy a true believer, or was he someone who was out for power who made a colossal miscalculation?
I think he was a true believer. And in fact, I was raised a Catholic, and I think you cannot absent his religious views from who he was. This guy was a religious fanatic from the age of 12. He, even as a teenager, he was fasting twice a week. He was praying 7 times a day. And to say that Islam had nothing to do with bin Laden is like saying the Crusades had nothing to do with Christianity. I mean, this is a guy who was a religious fanatic. So he was a true believer. And his idea of fun when he was a teenager was to get a group of his friends to come around and start singing religious chants about retaking Palestine. So that he's been like this from an early age. And I think it's tempting to try and discount people. Some people would like to discount religion or would try and discount religious beliefs, but I think they're very powerful, and they certainly animated him.
Back to the beginning. You spoke of various excuses for not taking Tora Bora with forces. What's your take on why we didn't go in with
I think,
troops on the ground?
you know, basically one of the more incompetent military commanders of American history, which is Tommy Franks. Tommy Franks screwed up 2 wars. It's pretty impressive to screw up one. But, you know, he retired 3 weeks after the fall of Baghdad, leaving, you know, a mess that we now know, you know, it could have been a lot better. So he just made bad military decisions. I mean, it was extraordinary. Yeah, I think you have to rewind the tape a little bit. The last war the United States had been involved in before 9/11 was Kosovo, in which no American soldiers had died, and a narrative, and before that, of course, there was the Black Hawk Down incident. So a narrative developed in the Pentagon that the U.S. public has zero tolerance for casualties, and we can't have casualties. And if you read Bob Woodward's book about the war against his very first one about the Afghan war, there was, you know, Rumsfeld was apoplectic that the CIA was in Afghanistan doing all this stuff before the U.S. military. And you look at Rumsfeld's biography, you know, he's sending memos to his people saying, why can't we not get people in? And so, you know, the army was very risk averse, and Tommy Franks was in charge, and he just made the wrong decision. I don't think it was that complicated. And oh, by the way, one kind of important detail. On December 3rd, 2001, when the battle began, Donald Rumsfeld tasked Tommy Franks with rewriting the Iraq war plan, which was 800 pages long, and so basically gave him a week. So, you know, the guy was, you know, anyway, suffice to say, mistakes were made.
Mr. Bergen, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed your presentation. Zero Dark 30 does give the impression that women in the intelligence community were vital or played some role in apprehending bin Laden. Is this general impression true?
Yes, and you know, I treat it in the book briefly, and the film that was based on my book that was on HBO kind of took that and made it into a whole appropriate story, which was the account of the female analyst of the CIA who tracked bin Laden. And Mike Scheuer, who was the head of the bin Laden unit, told me, you know, he would have liked to have put up a note saying no men apply for his unit, because he basically said, look, women are better analysts, they're smarter, they make connections, they're more patient, they don't tell war stories, they don't take cigarette breaks, and you know, and as a result, the unit was largely made up of women. And of course, one of the stories in Zero Dark 30, and also in my book and the HBO film, is the tragic story of Jessica Matthews, who was a mother of 3 in her mid-40s, who was killed by an al-Qaeda suicide bomber at Hosts in December 2009 by somebody she thought she'd recruited to find the leader, the number 2 in al-Qaeda. And she was one of the original, you know, people in the bin Laden unit. And there are others that I can name. Gina Bennett, who you know, wrote the very first memo that the U.S. government wrote about a guy called bin Laden, saying this guy's going to be a threat, was written by Gina Bennett in 1993. Another person is the person who wrote the August 6, 2001 presidential daily brief that bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S. It was written by somebody called Barbara Sood, who had a PhD in medieval Arabic theology from Princeton in the 70s, which must have seemed like a pretty obscure thing at the time, but turned out to be very useful in her subsequent career as an al-Qaeda analyst. So the point is that women analysts of the agency were very involved, and the Zero Dark 30 Jessica Chastain character does exist. I didn't speak to her, but the screenwriter for the film spoke to her at length, and it very much represents her view of what happened. So, you know, there's definitely more than, I mean, it's no surprise. I mean, the CIA has changed along with society. So, you know, it's an organization where women have many leadership roles.
Colby's not there anymore.
Right.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. Can I ask you, in terms of ethno-nationalist terrorism, sometimes we have a clear role or a clear aim that terrorists are aiming towards. in the case of bin Laden, it's a little bit less clear. Can we get your views or a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's global jihad as opposed to let's liberate Ireland or let's liberate, choose your country. So I think that it makes it much less legitimate. I mean, ethnocentric terrorism, let's liberate Ireland from the British, or let's liberate, choose your country from somebody else, has a lot of legitimacy and also is much more tethered to the public in a sense. I mean, one of the reasons bin Laden was, you know, an ethno-nationalist terrorist organization is going to be very careful about killing hundreds or thousands of civilians in a single attack for two reasons. They are concerned about public opinion in a way that Al-Qaeda is much less concerned. And they are concerned about, you know, a huge crackdown in a way that Al-Qaeda was less concerned about. So I think they're very different. And it's one of the reasons that bin Laden failed. I mean, if he had said, look, our goal is the liberation of Saudi Arabia from the Saudi royal family, that would have been a lot more doable, a lot more legitimate in many ways than we're just going to attack the United States and hope that they pull out of the Middle East as a result, which was a pipe dream, didn't succeed.
Hi, thank you. Three quick questions. The first is, can you explain more about this? Three quick questions. First, can you say about the second wave that you mentioned that would have happened? Second, what was the role of Zawahiri in the whole era? And it was number two. And the third one, following with that, is the U.S. planning to kill him as well?
In reverse order, yeah. I mean, they're definitely planning to kill him. And they've tried to kill him already. They almost succeeded in killing him in a drone strike in January of 2006. They killed, I think, a cousin or son instead. So, yeah, I think that they would, I'm sure there are people working now on trying to find where he is. You had another question about Zawahiri? Yeah. No. I mean, did Zawahiri lead to bin Laden? No. I mean, there's an incredibly bad book written by a former U.S. Navy SEAL, whose name I'm thankfully blanking on. But he makes the claim. He says that he talked to everybody on the raid. Basically, the whole thing's made up out of whole cloth. But the theory of his book is that Ayman al-Zawahiri tipped off the Americans so that they could kill bin Laden. Anyway, the whole thing doesn't make sense. But Zawahiri didn't lead to bin Laden, and then in terms of the second wave was a plan by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to have sent other people into the United States and do other attacks. Most of these attacks were very notional attacks. And that means Zacchaeus Moussaoui was given $6,000, told to do what he could. Obviously, it didn't work. So it was a less sophisticated group that were recruited. Ayman Faris, who was planning to bring down the Brooklyn Bridge with a pair of like a gas torch. By the way, if a obviously Pakistani person took out a gas torch on the Brooklyn Bridge and appeared to be trying to bring it down after 9/11, you know, which is one of the most heavily traveled places in the world, I think it would have attracted quite a lot of negative attention. Anyway, so it wasn't a serious plan, and he abandoned it. He said, "Look, there's too much surveillance on the bridge," and he was arrested, and so the second wave of attacks didn't materialize because they weren't serious, and the people that they recruited weren't very sophisticated.
Bergen, you gave the example of the capture of Eichmann, talking about intelligence, but in that decision-making process of the leadership of the American, you know, the people who were deciding whether to conduct this operation or not, came out the idea of trying to capture him alive in order to serve. The thing is that the Eichmann trial also served as a kind of collective psychoanalysis on the wounds of, and did anybody came up with that idea that a public trial of Osama bin Laden will help heal wounds in American society regarding, you know, all that 9/11 and all what happened afterwards? or nobody just, take him, if he resists, shoot him?
Shooting somebody who's conspicuously surrendering is a war crime. So, and that is not peculiar to the U.S., to the operation against bin Laden. So, if bin Laden had conspicuously surrendered, he would be alive today. And there was a plan to take him alive. There was a plan. They planned for every eventuality. One of which was bin Laden being taken alive, perhaps wounded. He would have been taken to Bagram Air Force Base. There was a group of FBI, CIA, high-value interrogators there, Arab linguists. They would have quickly talked to him there. Then they would have taken him to the USS Carl Vinson, and they would have kept him on the ship for perhaps months. Don't forget, this was a covert operation, which they hoped would not become public. And they would have just interrogated him on the ship for a while. So there was certainly a plan to take him alive. I don't think people thought it was very realistic. And so going to your question about a trial, there were lots of people at the CIA who always wanted just to kill bin Laden. They thought a trial would be a soapbox for bin Laden. They were very concerned that if bin Laden was captured, that his capture would be the impetus for Americans being kidnapped around the world in order to get him released from prison, which I think is a reasonable concern. So there were disagreements about in the CIA and other places about what the best course of action was. But I think bin Laden made his own choice about what he wanted, because he could have surrendered. I personally never thought he would. I took him at face value, that he was willing to die in this struggle. He didn't want to go to Guantanamo. He didn't want the humiliation of being taken by the Americans alive. On the other hand, he wasn't seeking martyrdom. The reason that there was the protests around bin Laden's death was so muted was talk about an unheroic ending. Instead of the battlefields of Tora Bora surrounded by his men fighting off the Americans heroically, he dies in a suburban compound surrounded by his 3 wives and dozen kids and grandkids and doesn't put up any resistance. It's not a heroic ending, but it's the ending he chose. Yeah.
You seem convinced that it wasn't a war crime, but everything you've said would indicate that of the list of possibilities, at the top, the most desirable was to kill him. So that other things being equal, the Navy SEALs going in probably intended to kill him. I mean, 15 minutes is a long time. The plane lands, the helicopter lands, it crashes, they come storming up the door, he's in the 3rd floor, the door is open, he doesn't have a gun in his hand. I mean, you could say he didn't prostrate himself and surrender. Right. On the other hand, there was not, it would seem that the message or the intention of the SEAL team was, unless otherwise proven clearly to be unarmed and to be surrendering, they wanted him dead. You seem to be arguing against that.
Well, let's start with the fact that I'm not a lawyer, or certainly not an international human rights lawyer. And this was a pretty confusing event for all concerned. I mean, one of the reasons we have different narratives by different Navy SEALs have said different things about what happened that night. We know from car accidents that 5 people watching a car accident have 5 different stories about what happened. So this was a moonless night, no electricity. The SEALs are wearing night vision goggles. There's a firefight. First, a helicopter crash in the first 1 minute. Then there's a firefight about 5 minutes later with one of his bodyguards in which he's killed. Then they kill bin Laden's son. They also kill another bodyguard. They kill a woman who's married to one of the bodyguards. They wound bin Laden's wife. A visit from the U.S. Navy SEALs is not a visit from the Red Cross, undoubtedly. But, I think that if he had, I just think, it is a fact that it is a war crime to shoot somebody who is conspicuously surrendering, and he didn't do that. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, I don't think you send the SEALs on an operation with the expectation. They are designed to kill people. I mean, that's what they're. I mean, at the end of the day, that's why you send the SEAL Team 6. But not always. I mean, we saw just now in Somalia. when they went in to try and kill the guy that they were going after the Eastgate Mall attack, that they retreated. They also took that guy, Abu Libby, alive in Libya, in Tripoli just now, which was a Delta Force operation. So I can't be certain, because no one can be certain given what I've just described. Bin Laden had repeatedly said, "I'm willing to die in this," and I think that's true.
I can just dovetail. Going back to the Shahid, I agree with you that there is no active mourning, but as somebody who is reading what is happening in, within the jihadi chat rooms and whatever, I cannot help but thinking that if I match what is written in what Osama bin Laden wrote in Abbottabad with what is happening, then really the best thing that he could have done was to become a Shahid. He could not talk himself top the 9/11, definitely not with the funding situation. The idea with Somalia was not only that they could not get funding, but because he didn't see them as al-Tawheed, he didn't see them as the monotheism and the global caliphate. He was against the Abu Amr al-Baghdadi and all the rest of them from Iraq, what Zawahiri was not. He was against the franchise. He's speaking in the Abbottabad as a very disillusioned person. Now, if that would have trickled down to, I'm thinking psychologically, right? If that had been trickling down to all the franchise that meanwhile Zawahiri was so keen on adding to Al-Qaeda, that would have been a major demoralizing effect. In contrast, he is now seen as a symbol, and I think he died just in time. What do you think?
No, I think you answered your own question. I think. Maybe, yeah. He was rescued by the U.S. Navy SEALs.
Or the Al-Qaeda ideology that is associated with him as a brand has been spared. All his internal disillusionments and his fanatic commitment to the global jihad, which alienated all the other forces that are fighting for regional and obviously have nationalistic agendas in their ideology, which he detested.
Yeah.
Mr. Bergen, I would like to ask you about the role of media. How would you address the role of media from the beginning of 9/11 attacks and until the hunting of Laden and those processes? Do you think the media sort of shortened the timing of Bin Laden hunting? Is there any effect directly to the, especially in terms of counterterrorism perspective?
I work in the media, and it's just like everywhere else. There are some people do good work, some people do bad work, some people are sociopaths, some people are lazy, some people. I think making generalizations about the media. There's been great reporting, there's been poor reporting, there's been very brave reporting. My friend Tim Hetherington was killed in Misrata, documenting the war against Gaddafi. I've had friends who've been killed in Iraq. I've had friends who, don't do their work. And I just think sort of making generalizations about the media, I think is difficult to sustain. Clearly, there was a huge, in the run-up to the Iraq War, the media didn't really do a very good job of skeptically probing what the government of both the United States and many other countries were claiming. Unfortunately, Saddam, kind of played into that by Saddam was lying about his capacity to his own his own generals. So I don't know. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, to be honest. Maybe you can clarify or.
Yeah, actually, in terms of counterterrorism perspective, is that gave some kind of advantages to the national security agencies in terms of solving and reaching the hunting bin Laden process? Do you think that media was just an observer, and because there are a lot of documentaries, so much movies, and so many things going on, media played a very important role during that process within 10 years?
Yeah, but I think that's sort of like saying, that does oxygen play an important process in life? Or, I mean, the media is sort of an imperfect reflection of reality. And, you know, I mean, is the question that the media made bin Laden into bin Laden? Or is that the question?
The question is, would it be more than 10 years, like maybe not, maybe SEAL team would have been capture him like 20 years later? Do you think that media shortened that process to capturing bin Laden?
No. Yeah. Let me make the following observation. You know, if you take, if you look at the intelligence budget since 9/11, we spent $500 billion, which is a very large sum of money. This is really an observation about it took. I don't think it took. It took way too long to find bin Laden, given the amount of resources we have. It should have been much quicker. So I wouldn't talk about the media in that context. I would talk about the failures of the intelligence community to get him earlier, and the national security community writ large. Which isn't to say that there wasn't good work done, and it was a very, you know, the process took a long time. A lot of good people were involved, but as I indicated earlier, he could have been stopped at the Battle of Tora Bora.
I'm more or less curious about your opinion on Al-Qaeda and Syria linking up. I'm working on a thesis about Syrian insurgency right now, and obviously a lot of my research has led to that. What do you think that means in terms of the United States and counterterrorism policy, or basically if we're at risk for something as great as an attack as 9/11 has been?
Yeah. Well, you know, Al-Qaeda in Syria seems to have learned from the mistakes of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and for the moment they aren't imposing large-scale Taliban rule on the population, and they are sort of acting as a sort of kinder and gentler Al-Qaeda, and they're organizing tug-of-war contests and ice cream eating contests and public meetings, and they seem to have learned from some of their mistakes, which is worrisome. And in fact, CNN had a very interesting piece the last 3 or 4 days by Nick Payton Walsh, where they basically surveyed activists in lots of different Syrian cities to say, is Al-Qaeda or the Al-Qaeda affiliates, which have, you know, different names, are they, you know, the biggest force in your town or city? And it turns out that much of northern Iraq is basically controlled by Al-Qaeda now. And so that is worrisome. Now, this could play out in lots of different ways. Al-Qaeda in Iraq controlled a third of the country in 2006 because they controlled Anbar province. They lost it because they pissed off the local tribes who rose up against them, who were then aided by the US military, and they were basically defeated. And now in Syria, you know, will they make sort of similar mistakes? Will some other outside force intervene? Would the United States intervene at a certain point? We don't know. But I think it is, you know, if Al-Qaeda can stage a resurrection, it is in Syria. And they do seem to have learned from their mistakes. They're behaving more like Hezbollah, providing social services to the population. And I think that's all a cause for concern. However, embedded in their DNA, I think they tend to make the same set of mistakes, which is they really want to impose Taliban-style rule on the population. And that tends to go down poorly. Look at what happened in Mali. In Mali, they imposed Taliban-style rule on the population in northern Mali, which is the size of France. They just waited around until they were liberated by the French military, which until relatively recently controlled Mali. It's not often that a country that formerly occupied you is then greeted as an army of liberation, but that's what happened. So that's how it could play out. But another way it could play out is, you know, lots of foreign jihadis go to Syria and they get training and then they try and do attacks in the West. That was a concern during the Iraq War, but it didn't happen because we're much more cognizant of the problem than they would have been during the Afghan War. So that's a long way of saying I don't know what's going to happen. Yogi Berra said it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future, so that's how I feel.
So, you know, one of the most interesting points you made, I thought, was that there were the absence of demonstrations when he died, and that in a way it symbolizes the end of the war on terror as it was formulated by Bush. But don't you think that, and you said, but just before we started the seminar, that the book you're currently working on now is Domestic Terrorism, American, and don't you think that the way in which somebody like that can live on the internet gives a kind of an immortality to and a potential inspiration for terrorists everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And if you look at Al-Awlaki, in literally 24 cases in the United States and in other cases, he continues. He was influential on the Tsarnaev brothers, so even in death, he's sort of influential. So yeah, I mean, these ideas can linger on. It's an interesting question about how ideas die. Marxist-Leninism is still current probably in some pockets of maybe even this college. But Marxist-Leninism largely died when the Soviet Union expired. Marxist-Leninism sort of died along with it. I think it's going to be harder to kill Al-Qaedism as an idea because it makes claims to do with God that are less sort of disprovable by actual events. So the Soviet Union didn't work. It was a Marxist-Leninist state. That spoke for itself. Since Al-Qaeda claims to be, that sort of authorized by God, these ideas are quite difficult to die. But I think that they can become less and less relevant over time, so that they become sort of nuisances rather than national security problems. And I think we're at the stage where it's sort of a nuisance, except in places like Syria, but even there, the prognosis, for the reasons I've already outlined, could be bad. And certainly, if you look at, if I was Osama bin Laden scoring this, in Yemen, I lost. They controlled a good chunk of the country. That's over. In Mali, they lost. They've lost in Afghanistan. They've, to some degree, lost in Pakistan. They've completely lost in Southeast Asia. If we'd had this conversation in 2003, we'd be concerned about Jamaat Islamiyah and their capabilities throughout Southeast Asia. They're basically gone. So, these groups, they don't have to be around forever.
Listen, on that hopeful note,